Hi, Dave. Thanks for being here and sharing this interesting story.
Glad to be here.
You are currently a professor emeritus at UNI, having retired in 2001.
That's right. That's right. That's over 20 years ago by my calculation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I taught org psych for, I think, like 24 years in a row, I think, almost every semester for 24 years in a row. And of course, I did a lot of other off-campus stuff. I did a lot of consulting work, used some of the ideas we're going to talk about, but some of the other stuff as hands-on stuff, which I was then able to bring into class, and we could talk about how I was using Herzberg's thinking, which is what I was doing, to apply it to different stuff. So yeah, that's
All right. Well,
long.
let's get to your work with Herzberg. So,
Okay.
work psychologists, which is what we're now at UNI calling industrial organizational psychology. So work psychologists try to improve the performance, health, and happiness of people at work.
Mhm.
HR and managerial professionals will oftentimes try to target the policies and procedures in the organization to impact the quality of the work experience. But those weren't the focus in your career.
No, no, that's right. Um, as a result of my connection with Herzberg, as we'll talk about a little bit more, I was interested in human motivation as it occurred in the workplace, and general what we sometimes then call morale uh, in the workplace too. But I was looking at the content of the tasks we gave people to do, the content of their work, what Herzberg called the work itself. So that was the focus of what I was doing. And what a lot of what I was doing was to use a tactic that grew out of his thinking, which we call job enrichment, which was designed, which had to do with changing the way the work was done by building in, for example, decision-making opportunities into jobs who didn't have them. Or sometimes it had to do if you had a series of jobs that were on almost like a production line. Sometimes it had to do with expanding the job horizontally so people got to start and finish something that felt whole to them, that felt complete to them. Herzberg, he when I took his student at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, which, by the way, when I got my degree was not called Case Western Reserve. There were two. Those are two colleges.
Yeah.
Western Reserve University was the one that I was a student in, and Herzberg's under Herzberg. But Case Institute of Technology was just across Euclid Avenue, right across the other side of Euclid Avenue in Cleveland. And maybe your students will know, I don't know, but you know what the Michelson-Morley experiments were? They were related to Einstein's thinking about relativity. Those studies were done at Case Institute of Technology.
Interesting.
On the other side. But so it was Case Western Reserve University. The year I graduated is when they switched over to that. They now have that.
Well,
go ahead.
So Herzberg developed this two-factor theory of motivation.
Mhm.
We don't need to cover the theory in depth and its basis in Maslow's need theory and all that.
Right.
But maybe you can talk a little bit about the fundamental assumption of the theory, which you've hit upon slightly already, but just to review for the students.
Well, what I would say is that the core idea is that the work itself, the task itself, is, if it's challenging and stimulating and interesting, that's the driver of motivation and satisfaction. So that the activity of my stuff as a consultant, and certainly of Herzberg's work, was focused on looking at what are we giving people to do? How are they spending their time? Is it interesting to them to spend their time that way? Or do they feel like they're learning anything or anything new? If they weren't, there'd been very little focus on that, as you pointed out earlier. Nobody was talking about the work content itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that when we started focusing on that was new to a whole lot of people. And Herzberg was well known because he had a reputation, international actually. And so he would be invited into some company or other to talk about his theory, his two-factor theory. And he would use terms that, like some that I just used, job enrichment and all that kind of stuff. But the funny thing about it was Herzberg had no idea how to consult. He had no idea how to deliver this to an organization that could then take his theory and use it. So he would sometimes say to us in class, if you were running such and such a company that he had told us, what would you do? It was his theory, but the truth was he didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
He really didn't know what to do. But he would take us along sometimes when we'd go into the company. And this happened with he and I at General Motors when he used to do a 1 month, for 10 months a year, he did a 1-day seminar for the engineering management people at General Motors. But he hated it. He hated doing it, going and giving the talk. And one of the reasons he hated it was the engineers, being who they were, would always ask these questions like, well, what would you do about that? How could you? And he didn't know. He'd say, well, you enrich the job. You build, but that didn't mean anything to them. And it didn't mean anything useful to him. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't do anything about it. But I was one of the students that got very much into that because one time he couldn't make the General Motors meeting. And they said, but Fred, we got these 30 guys that are coming in. We got to do it. And Herzberg said, well, I got a couple of students that can, if you just want to hear the theory, they can probably do it. Well, who are they? Well, this Whitsettt kid, he's pretty good, So I replaced him once. This was supposed to be once. At the end of my session, the guy who ran the session said, if you wanted to come other times instead of that would be okay. Well, there was no way I was going to go back home and say, guess what, Fred, you lost your job. I took over your job. However, he did say, well, they called, they think you did a pretty good job there, I said, oh, well, that's pretty good. And he says, maybe you ought to do it. And I said, well, I don't know, maybe I should. And so he said, I'm sitting in his office. He picks up the phone. He dials this guy up at General Motors in Detroit. And he says, remember that kid that was up there, which is what he called me, that kid that was up there 2 weeks ago? Well, I think I'm going to send him back again. What do you think of that? So I said, okay. Oh, I don't know, half of what you give me, whatever, He was getting $1,000 a day to do that. But we're talking about let's see, about probably 1975, something like that. No, before that even. Yeah, but anyway, so they started offering me, my income went up $500 a month, starting right then while I was a graduate student. Adam, you know what my graduate stipend was? $1,500 a semester. That's all I was getting from the university. Okay, so I started getting $500 a month. Now I'm up there at General Motors talking about this, but when the engineers would say to me, well, what would you do about that? I started talking. I would say, well, if the task is laid out like this, see, the guy can't make any choices. He's got to do it that, etc. That's how I got started in consulting. That led to other clients at Prudential Insurance I worked for years. A company called Cryovac, which is headquartered in South Carolina and makes paper and plastic products. I started consulting for them. So I was doing all this kind of consulting work. So I get done with my PhD in 1967, and Fred says to me, so now what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. And he says, well, why don't you come with me? Sometimes I go over to the VA hospital over here and we do some stuff over there. And me thinking of Herzberg at the VA, there was a lot of crazy guys over there. Some guys that had serious emotional difficulty. So I couldn't imagine what Herzberg was going to do, but he said I could go with him. That's where the story we're going to in a minute. That's how it came. I was just going to trail him along to see what the hell he was going to do.
All right. Well, that's what we're here to hear.
Right.
Is that story, because I think it's unusual for an IO psychologist to be working with people that have,
absolutely, it's very unusual, especially if he had such a low skill level, which he had. He had no idea how to do clinical stuff. It's just that he was a famous psychologist, and the VA hospital was in walking distance across the campus. So that's why he was invited to come over there. And it's also why he took me. I was sitting in his office that day, so I went along with him. Now, we go in over at one side of the building, the VA hospital building there, they had these offices that were full-time, but there were some consultation offices. And that's where Fred got, because he didn't have an office over there. So we go, and the head clinical guy says, yeah, well, I want you to talk to, and he names this guy. I don't even remember the guy's name, but he was a mental, what we call a mental patient. He was post World War II guy, still around, had been in the hospital for, I don't know, 20 years or whatever the hell it was. And so they said, we're going to bring him in, see if you can do anything for him. So Herzberg says, all right. So Herzberg and I are sitting there at one side of the desk. The door opens. Here comes one of the clinicians in with this guy who looked very disheveled, probably a guy about 45 years old, maybe something like that. But he'd been in the hospital for at least 20 years or whatever it was. And he's all kind of hanging down, his head hanging down like that. So they bring him in, he sits down, goes like that. And Fred's looking at his paperwork, you know, and Fred says, so what do you think about, what are you doing in here? And the guy kind of goes like this. Kind of shrugs his shoulders like he doesn't know what the hell he's doing in there. And he says, well, my mom was, and Fred says, stop. I don't give a damn about your mom. I don't want to talk about your mom. I want to talk about you. Shrugs his shoulders again. Nothing, doesn't say a thing. Fred says 3 or 4 times, well, what else you got going? Keeps shrugging his shoulders and not doing anything. After 3 or 4 times, Fred says, well, we're not going to get anywhere unless you start talking about something different than your mom or whatever your dad did to you when you were a kid. The guy didn't make any noise. So Fred says, all right, we're going, see ya. He goes to the door and he says to the clinician, I don't know what the heck this guy's doing, but I don't have anything for him. And the clinician says, well, we got you set up for several times. Come on back next week. Maybe he'll come back. So a week later, we go back again, same deal. So wants to talk about his mom or how his dad was a tough guy or whatever the hell it was. Fred listens for about 10 minutes and he says, I don't care about that. I told you I don't want to hear about that. That's not why we're here. Now tell me this, what do you like to do? The guy looks at him like he's talking in some foreign language. You know, what do you, he kind of goes like this. Fred says, what do you like to do? Kind of goes like that. So we'd ask that about 3 or 4 times. The guy finally hangs his head down. Fred says, get out of here. But the next time you come back, I want to hear what you like to do. One more week, he comes back. The guy walks in, sits down, says something about his brother or his mother. And Fred says, that's it. That's it. Listen to this question. I remember him saying this. What do you like to do? The guy says, build boats. And Fred says, what are you talking about? Model boats. I like them. I like them. He's got his hands out like this. Fred says, build boats, that's it? Guy says, yep. Fred turns to me and he says, take him to the store over there on the corner, where they do the stuff for the hobby store over there. Take him over there. I'll see you when we get back. So I walk with this guy over to the hobby store. We go in, he's looking around like this. And I said to the guy running the store, this guy likes to build boats. You got boats? Oh, we got boats. Come on. He takes them to the back room and they've got all kinds of balsa wood, you know, that you had to come to, some plastic parts and stuff. Fred had said, let him have whatever one he wants. He picks out this monster thing. It's about 3 feet long before the thing starts. He's holding it in both arms like that. And so we walk back over to the hospital. And I said, I think Fred wants you to start on that and we'll look at it next week. Guy kind of makes a funny face, you know, so he walks off with this big model under his arms. A week later, we go back in. He's got a few little parts he started with, but that's it. No big deal, but he did look at it. He did something. Fred said, the guy says, you know, my mom used to think, and Fred said, I told you I don't want to hear about it. Tell me what you're doing with this boat. So the guy starts showing a little bit of interest. He says, well, this part here was kind of interesting. So he finally, there's some energy started coming from him. He started having more to say. Fred says, good, I want to see how much you can get done by next week on this thing and we'll come back. We come back the next week. The guy's got the thing about half done. Damn thing's about 3 feet high and all kind of parts and stuff. And the guy says, look at this part. This was the hardest part. Come here, come around here. I'll show you what's going on. Totally different attitude towards everything. Fred says, All right, good. All right, that's good. Oh, what about this part? Well, that's going to be the hardest part. There was all this conversation. So Fred says, all right, we'll come back next week and see what you're doing. So we do. The next week we come back, the clinician comes in and says, Fred, or whatever his name was, Joey can't, he won't be here today. And Herzberg says, what do you mean he won't be here today? What the hell else has he got going? The clinician says, well, he's got about 6 or other patients. He's teaching a class in boat building to these other 6 or 8 people. So he said he couldn't make it to the meeting today. Well, you can see where that's headed. The guy ends up building, I mean, he was good at it. Not only was he good at doing it with things, he was good at getting the other people to do it. And as they got into it, as they got turned on to it, they spread the stuff doing. I heard later that they had over 200 people building something, not necessarily all boats, but doing something, all of whom were VA hospital patients.
Mhm. That's a good story.
Yep, it's true. It's true. So you know, we'll talk about whatever aspect of it you want, but it was the fact that Herzberg, he was totally disinterested in the stuff that clinical psychologists are normally stuff. So I guess there's one part I left out, I should tell you. Something like 6 or 8 months later, something like that, we were going over at the hospital doing something with somebody else, and we see this guy. And Fred says to him, how you doing? And he says to him, you know what? I'm doing all right. And he says, one of the things that I like now is my mom doesn't even show up here anymore. And you know what? I don't give a shit. I don't care whether she comes or not. So what was happening was his abilities, his feelings of competence, of ability to do stuff, were now transferring into other aspects of his life. So he was making what would be thought of as normal clinical advances when the clinician never talked about it with him, that being Herzberg.
Yeah.
So that was what was going on. I loved it. I thought it was great. It was fun to watch.
So it's a great story that, and I don't want to give too much away because I want the students to respond.
Sure.
On our.
That's why I stopped there. I figured I could.
In our learning management system. But I think what's great is that it's demonstrating the psychological impact of doing something.
Yep. And feeling good about yourself because you could do it. Can't be too easy to do. It's got to have some challenge to it. And as you get good at it, you start to feel like a capable, competent person, and it's exciting. So that this might be too much to give away, but I'll say it, you can cut it out if you want.
That's fine.
The achievement leads to motivation. Motivation in Herzberg's thinking is a consequence of achievement. It's the achievement, it makes you feel good and you want to make that happen again. So you start seeking out opportunities to do something well. And when you do something well, you come to believe you could do other things well. That's what the whole thing was going. And so when I went into doing consulting work later, I took that same idea that he taught me into wherever it was, Prudential or General Motors, whatever, and we looked for ways to make work the kind of experience that would make people feel good about themselves.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave. Thanks for sharing that great story. And for the students watching this, you can see the question prompts to respond to on our learning management system. And I'm going to stop the recording, but Dave, just hold tight.
Okay.